The winter of 1942 on the Eastern Front was not merely cold, it was a living enemy, deliberate and patient. Snow fell in dense curtains across the endless Russian steppe, erasing tracks, muffling sounds, turning every movement into exhaustion. Temperatures plunged far below freezing fuel in tanks, cracking metal, numbing fingers until they could no longer pull triggers. Yet amid this white desolation, the German Sixth Army held its ground with the precision of a machine that had not yet begun to fail. At the heart of this army stood General Friedrich von Arnstadt, a figure almost archetypal in his correctness. 52 years old, tall and spare, with the bearing of old Prussian aristocracy tempered by decades of staff colleges and campaigns. His face was lean, his eyes pale blue and unflinching. He wore his decorations modestly, the Iron Cross from the Great War, the Knight's Cross from France, but he carried them as reminders of duty fulfilled, not personal glory. Those who served under him described him, without irony, as the perfect general, methodical, calm, utterly loyal to the hierarchy that had shaped him. Von Arnstadt believed deeply in the chain of command. He had seen armies win through obedience where brilliance alone would have faltered. He had watched lesser commanders seize initiative and invite disaster. For him, discipline was not merely a virtue. It was the only reliable foundation in the chaos of war. Success, he often said quietly to his staff, was measured not by territory gained or enemy killed, but by orders executed faithfully. Outcomes belonged to higher authority. Execution belonged to him. On the morning of 19th of November 1942, in a timber-reinforced bunker near the airfield at Tutsinskaya, a radio operator handed him a decrypted message on yellow, flimsy paper. The room was dimly lit by kerosene lamps. Maps covered every wall, pinned with colored symbols that still showed German strength stretching confidently to the Volga. Von Arnstadt read the message in silence. The text was unambiguous. To Commander, 6th Army. The Führer has personally directed that the positions at Stalingrad and along the Volga will be held at all costs. There will be no withdrawal under any circumstances. Relief forces are being concentrated under Field Marshal von Manstein. Air supply is guaranteed at sufficient levels. The fortress is to be defended to the last man and the last round. Zeitzler, Okh. He read it twice, absorbing every word. There was no flourish, no appeal to emotion, only clarity. He folded the paper with precise creases and laid it on the central map table. His staff waited. Colonel Hans Ritter, his chief of operations, stood with arms crossed, studying the general's face for any flicker of concern. Major Klaus Weber, the intelligence officer, shifted his weight impatiently. Captain Erich Brandt, the adjutant, held his notebook ready. Von Arnstadt spoke first. The Führer has given us our mission. We will hold. His voice was level, almost conversational, as if announcing the weather. He turned to the map and traced the long blue line of the 6th Army's front with one gloved finger. We possess 22 divisions, more than 300,000 men, ammunition reserves for prolonged defensive fighting, fuel for weeks at reduced expenditure. The city itself is a fortress of rubble, ideal for defense. The Luftwaffe has committed to 700 tons of supplies daily. Manstein is already assembling the relief army. He paused, letting the facts settle. There will be no retreat, there will be no questioning. We have been entrusted with the decisive point. We will not fail. Colonel Ritter cleared his throat. Herr General, Soviet concentrations opposite the Romanians continue to build. Reconnaissance shows massed armor. Von Arnstadt nodded once. I have seen the reports. The flanks are held by our allies. Our task is the center. The order is explicit. No one pressed further. They knew his mind. Initiative was admirable in subordinates when directed. In a commander facing higher authority, it bordered on disloyalty. That afternoon, the Army order was drafted and transmitted. 6th Army Directive. All units will maintain present positions. No withdrawal without express permission from this headquarters. Countersigned by higher authority. The eyes of the Reich and the judgment of history rest upon our steadfastness. Every man will do his duty. Across the vast pocket that would soon form, the order reached the front lines. In shattered factories along the Volga, where German infantry huddled in cellars amid the stink of cordite and unburied dead, officers read it aloud by flashlight. In snow-covered trenches west of the Don, panzer crews stamped their feet and listened without comment. In field hospitals, wounded men heard it and nodded grimly. The army obeyed, as it always had. That evening, von Arnstadt sat alone at his small desk. He opened his leather-bound war diary and began to write. 19th November 1942. Received Führer order to hold Stalingrad at all costs. Acknowledged immediately and without reservation. The army is strong, well-supplied, and positioned advantageously. Doubt is the solvent of discipline. Certainty is its reinforcement. If every general begins to interpret rather than execute, the structure collapses from within. We will hold because we must, and because holding is victory until victory arrives. He paused, dipping his pen. There is profound strength in submission to higher will. The individual mind is fallible. The collective hierarchy, when unified, approaches perfection. I will not be the point of fracture. He closed the diary and stood at the map again. The situation overlays showed Soviet arrows probing, but nothing decisive. The blue rectangle of 6th Army remained solid, imposing. The following days brought increasing tension. Artillery fire intensified along the northern flank. Reports arrived of Soviet bridgeheads across the frozen Don. Romanian units requested support, then urgently demanded it. Von Arnstadt received each message with the same calm attention. He noted the deteriorating situation on the flanks, but his responses remained unchanged. The order stands, hold your positions. When Colonel Ritter suggested shifting a panzer division northward as a precaution, von Arnstadt listened patiently. We cannot weaken the Volga front. The enemy expects us to disperse. We will concentrate. Relief is coming. Ritter accepted the decision without protest. By 20th November, the Soviet offensive erupted in full force. Thousands of guns opened along the Romanian sectors. T-34s surged forward in white camouflage, overwhelming defenses that crumbled almost immediately. German liaison officers sent frantic signals as entire corps dissolved. In the bunker, teletype machines clattered incessantly. The map filled with red arrows curving southward. Still, von Arnstadt's demeanor did not alter. He stood for hours, directing minor adjustments, shortening lines here, reinforcing a strong point there, but never contemplating the larger movement that might have saved the army. On the night of 22nd of November, final confirmation arrived. Soviet spearheads had linked up at Kalach. The ring was closed. 300,000 men, 22 divisions, an entire army encircled. The staff gathered in silence around the updated map. The red circle was complete. Von Arnstadt studied it for a long while. Then he spoke. The situation is grave, but not without precedent. Verdun was held encircled. Leningrad endures encirclement. We now possess the advantage of interior lines. Every kilometer the enemy advances costs him blood against prepared defenses. The Luftwaffe will sustain us. Manstein will strike from outside. He turned to his officers. We transform necessity into strength. Discipline has brought us this far. Discipline will carry us through. A young staff officer ventured, Herr General, a breakout now, while the encirclement is thin. Von Arnstadt interrupted gently but firmly. The Führer has forbidden withdrawal. To request it would be defeatism. To attempt it without permission would fracture the army at its head. We will not begin the disintegration. Silence returned. Later, alone once more, von Arnstadt stood before the map. The pocket measured roughly 60 kilometers east to west, 40 north to south. Compact, defensible. Sustainable if the promise is held. The thought came, quiet but insistent. A signal now, requesting freedom of action. A concentrated blow eastward before the Soviets consolidate. He imagined drafting it. He imagined the reply. Denial, sharp and irrevocable. Worse, relief from command, the army left to a successor in the moment of crisis. No, he concluded, one act of independence at the top invites 1,000 below. The chain must hold, beginning with me. He turned away from the map, shoulders square. At that moment, obedience felt like strength. December 1942 arrived with a cruelty the men had not imagined possible. The temperature fell to -30 degrees Celsius and lower, turning the snow into a fine, glassy powder that worked its way into every seam of clothing. Breath froze on beards. Rifles had to be warmed against the body before they would fire. Engines refused to start without hours of preheating. The steppe, once merely hostile, became lethal. Inside the pocket, the 6th Army settled into its new reality. Encircled, but still formidable. The front now measured less than 200 kilometers in circumference. Internal supply lines were short. Every division was within reach of the others. On paper, it remained one of the most powerful formations in military history. General von Arnstadt maintained his routine with meticulous care. He rose at the same hour, reviewed the overnight reports, met with his staff at precisely 9, toured forward positions when weather permitted. His calm was contagious, or at least it suppressed open discontent. He repeated the same assurances daily. The Luftwaffe would deliver, Manstein would break through, the fortress would hold. Yet beneath the surface, the first cracks began to appear. The promised 700 tons of supplies per day never materialized. On good days, the air fleet managed 300. On bad days, when blizzards closed the airfields or Soviet fighters and flak took their toll, barely 100 tons reached the pocket. Ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies all began to dwindle in careful bureaucratic increments. Von Arnstadt noted the shortfalls in the daily logistics conference. His quartermaster, a meticulous colonel named Schmidt, presented the figures without drama. Current daily requirement, approximately 1,200 tons to maintain full combat effectiveness. Current delivery, average 220 tons. Deficit accumulating at 980 tons per day. Von Arnstadt nodded. Then we will reduce consumption accordingly, rations to 2/3, ammunition expenditure restricted to defensive fire only. Fuel for essential movements. Schmidt hesitated. Herr General, the men are already on reduced rations. Horses are being slaughtered at an increasing rate. The hospitals report rising cases of exhaustion and frostbite. The order stands, Von Arnstadt replied quietly. We hold until relieved. Economy will extend our endurance. No one argued. Argument would have implied doubt. Reports from the front lines began to change tone, almost imperceptibly at first. Division commanders, accustomed to crisp, confident language, started to soften their assessments. Where once a report might have read, enemy probing attacks repulsed with heavy losses, it now read, local enemy activity contained. Where once position firm had sufficed, phrases like, situation tense but under control appeared. Von Arnstadt noticed the shift. He summoned Colonel Ritter. These reports lack precision. I want facts, not impressions. Ritter shifted uncomfortably. The commanders are aware that higher headquarters dislikes pessimistic language, Herr General. They phrase accordingly. Von Arnstadt considered this. Then remind them that accuracy serves the right better than optimism. But the order remains. We hold. The reminder was sent. The reports improved, for a week. Then the softening resumed. At the front, reality diverged further from official language. In the ruined brickworks south of the city, a company of infantry watched Soviet ski troops infiltrate their lines under cover of snow squalls. They drove them back, but at the cost of half their remaining machine gun ammunition. The company commander radioed for resupply. The battalion replied that none was available. The commander did not report the engagement as a victory. He reported it as enemy reconnaissance in force repelled. The battalion passed it upward, unchanged. By the time it reached Army headquarters, it read, quiet on the sector. In a frozen ravine west of the pocket, panzer crews siphoned fuel from damaged vehicles to keep a handful operational. They camouflaged the wrecks with snow and reported them as in workshop for long-term repair. No one asked questions. The official strength return still showed 80% of tanks combat-ready. In field hospitals, surgeons operated without anesthesia using frozen vodka when available. They amputated frostbitten limbs with handsaws. The wounded lay on straw in unheated barns, their breath visible in the lantern light. Medical officers requested evacuation flights. The Luftwaffe replied that priority belonged to ammunition and food. The wounded stayed. Mortality rose. The report spoke of satisfactory medical situation. Ordinary soldiers adapted in ways the system could not. They burned furniture, scavenged from ruined houses to stay warm. They traded watches and rings with Russian civilians for potatoes and bread. They learned to thaw frozen bread by placing it inside their shirts against their skin. They dismantled abandoned vehicles for parts, improvised stoves from ammunition cans, fashioned sledges from doors. Survival became a matter of individual ingenuity, not official direction. Officers looked the other way. Discipline held, but it held in silence. Von Arnstadt received occasional hints of this underground adaptation. A junior officer, newly arrived from leave in Germany, mentioned in passing the resourcefulness of the troops. Von Arnstadt frowned. Resourcefulness is admirable when channeled through command, otherwise it borders on indiscipline. The remark was noted. Such comments ceased. Christmas approached. The High Command in East Prussia sent greetings and promises of imminent relief. Göring himself broadcast assurances that the Luftwaffe would increase deliveries. A special airlift brought mail, iron rations, and small gifts, cigarettes, chocolate, knitted scarves from schoolchildren. The men received these tokens with muted gratitude. They wrote letters home, speaking of confidence and duty. Few mentioned the cold, the hunger, the shortening odds. Von Arnstadt spent Christmas Eve in the command bunker, reviewing the latest situation maps. Soviet pressure was constant now, probing every sector, seeking weakness. Casualties mounted. Replacements did not exist. Divisions reported effective strengths at 60, sometimes 50%. He drafted a signal to Army Group requesting clarification on the relief operation. Situation serious but stable, supply shortfall critical, request timeline for Manstein offensive. The reply came swiftly. Relief operation in preparation. Continue to hold. No change in mission. He read it twice, then filed it. Later that night, he stood outside the bunker for a moment, staring into the black, starless sky. Snow fell softly. Somewhere distant, artillery rumbled like continuous thunder. He thought of his family in Berlin, of the Christmas tree they would have lit without him. They will understand, he told himself. Duty demands separation. He returned inside. January brought no relief. The airlift continued to fall short. Horses, once 3,000 in the pocket, were reduced to hundreds, then dozens. The last were slaughtered for meat. Rations dropped to 200 grams of bread per day, sometimes less. Men grew gaunt, faces sharpened, eyes sank. Soviet loudspeakers began broadcasting across the lines, offering food and warm quarters to those who surrendered. Few listened openly, but the messages carried on the wind. Junior officers began to speak more freely in private. A regimental commander confided to his staff that the pocket could not hold beyond February without substantial supply improvement. The remark traveled upward through informal channels. It reached Colonel Ritter, who mentioned it carefully to von Arnstadt. The general's response was measured. Such opinions undermine resolve. Remind the officer that speculation is not his responsibility, execution is. The reminder was delivered. The officer apologized. The opinion did not vanish. It merely went deeper underground. Von Arnstadt began to notice the silence growing heavier. Where once staff meetings had featured discussion, now they featured reports followed by quiet acceptance. Questions dwindled. Initiative evaporated. He told himself this was the mark of true discipline, unity of purpose without distraction. Yet in the quiet hours, doubt stirred. Brief, suppressed, but persistent. The system is designed to correct itself, he reasoned. Higher authority sees the larger picture. My role is to maintain the position until correction arrives. But the correction did not arrive. The soldiers kept adapting. They boiled snow for water when wells froze. They wrapped newspapers under uniforms for insulation. They shared the last cigarettes down to the final drag. They survived, day by day, through small, unrecorded acts of ingenuity. The staff kept reporting. The language remained confident, measured, acceptable. The general kept obeying. The army was adapting. The system was not. January 1943 deepened the cold and the silence. The pocket shrank under constant Soviet pressure, not in dramatic assaults, but in slow, methodical bites. Villages lost here, a hill taken there, strong points isolated and reduced. Each day, the front line moved inward by a kilometer or two, sometimes less. The map in the command bunker grew crowded with new red overlays, yet the blue core remained, diminished but intact. General von Arnstadt continued his daily rhythm. He reviewed the morning reports, adjusted defensive allocations with precise economy, drafted signals to higher headquarters that remained courteous, factual, and uncomplaining. His tone never varied. His handwriting stayed neat. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, the fracture began. It started with small, almost imperceptible moments. A staff officer pausing too long over a casualty return. A division commander requesting permission to evacuate wounded by sled across the frozen Volga. Permission denied because it might be interpreted as preparation for withdrawal. A logistics report that openly stated for the first time that ammunition reserves would be exhausted in defensive fighting within 4 weeks at current rates. Von Arnstadt read each document carefully. He annotated margins in his small, precise script, noted, "Economy measures to continue. Hold present line." But the numbers no longer aligned with the assurances he had repeated for weeks. The Luftwaffe deliveries fell further. Blizzards closed the external airfields for days at a time. Soviet anti-aircraft fire improved. Ju-52s and He-111s arrived in smaller formations, more frequently shot down. The daily average dropped below 100 tons. Bread rations were reduced to 100 grams per man. Then to 50. Then to bread soup thickened with horse meat when available. Men began to die not from bullets, but from exhaustion and hunger. Frostbite claimed fingers, toes, ears, noses. Dysentery spread in the overcrowded bunkers. Typhus appeared in isolated outbreaks. The hospitals overflowed. Surgeons selected who could be saved and who would be left to the morphine and the cold. Reports reflected none of this in full. Division commanders, conditioned by months of careful language, continued to describe their situations as strained but stable, tense but manageable. Casualty figures were accurate, but accompanied by phrases like combat effectiveness maintained through reorganization. Von Arnstadt knew the reports were softened. He had ordered accuracy, but accuracy that admitted collapse would force higher command to confront failure, and higher command had forbidden confrontation with failure. So the reports walked the narrow line between truth and acceptability. He did not reprimand the senders. He understood the dilemma. He shared it. In private conversations, junior officers began to speak more openly. They did not challenge the general directly. They spoke among themselves, in low voices, in corners of the bunker. A major from a panzer division remarked that the remaining tanks, barely 40 runners across the entire army, could mount one limited counterattack, perhaps enough to break the ring in a narrow sector if launched immediately. A regimental commander suggested abandoning the northern salient, shortening the front by 20 kilometers, conserving strength. An artillery officer calculated that concentrated fire could still disrupt a Soviet offensive if ammunition were husbanded for one decisive moment. These suggestions traveled upward through informal channels, never as formal proposals, always as considerations or observations. They reached Colonel Ritter, who weighed them carefully before deciding whether to bring them to the general. Ritter brought a few. Carefully. Von Arnstadt listened without interruption. His responses were always the same in essence. The order prohibits withdrawal or major realignment without permission. To request such permission would be interpreted as defeatism. We will maintain the present posture until relieved. Ritter nodded and withdrew. One evening in mid-January, after a particularly grim day of reports, 2 battalions overrun in the factory district, an entire regiment reduced to company strength, Ritter lingered after the staff meeting. "Herr General," he began quietly, "may I speak freely?" Von Arnstadt looked up from the map. "Always, Hans. The men are reaching their limit, not courage, their physical limit. The soldiers believe in you. They will follow any order you give. Perhaps a direct appeal to the Führer. A personal signal explaining the reality here. He trusts your judgment." Von Arnstadt was silent for a long moment. "I have sent factual reports daily," he said at last. "Higher headquarters has the complete picture." Ritter hesitated. "With respect, Herr General, they have the picture we are permitted to send." Another silence. Von Arnstadt turned back to the map. "If I bypass the chain and appeal directly, I admit that the chain has failed. If I request freedom of action, I imply that the original order was mistaken. Either act undermines the structure we depend upon. The army cannot function if every commander substitutes his judgment for higher direction." Ritter lowered his eyes. "I understand." He left. That night, von Arnstadt sat alone at his desk. The bunker was quiet, except for the distant thump of artillery and the occasional clatter of the teletype. He opened his war diary for the first time in days. 15th January 1943. Supply situation critical. Combat strength declining rapidly. Enemy pressure increasing on all sectors. Higher headquarters informed, no change in mission received. He stared at the page. Then, in smaller script beneath, "The question is no longer whether we can hold indefinitely. The question is whether we can hold long enough for relief. The promises have not been fulfilled. Yet the order remains." He paused, pen hovering. "To continue obedience preserves the principle. To break it preserves the army. But if I break it, I destroy the principle upon which the army and the Reich rests. And if the army is destroyed through obedience, the principle survives without purpose. He closed the diary without signing the entry. The next day brought a signal from Army Group Dawn. Field Marshal von Manstein's relief effort, Operation Winter Storm, had reached its furthest point in December and been forced to withdraw. A new attempt was being prepared, but required time. Sixth Army was to continue holding, tying down Soviet forces. Von Arnstadt read it twice, then filed it with the others. He did not share the full text with his staff. He summarized, "Relief preparations continue, our task unchanged." In the trenches, soldiers heard rumors. Some believed them, most simply endured. They had learned that hope was a luxury they could no longer afford. They focused on the next hour, the next crust of bread, the next watch in the frozen dugout. Small groups began to cross the lines at night. Not many. Discipline still held, but enough that battalion commanders noticed. They reported the losses as killed in action or missing on patrol. No one investigated. Soviet assaults intensified. They came methodically, preceded by massive artillery, supported by tanks and infantry in overwhelming numbers. German strongpoints held for hours, sometimes days, then collapsed from within as ammunition ran out or men simply could no longer lift their weapons. Von Arnstadt visited the front when possible. He drove in his Kugelwagen along icy tracks, accompanied only by his driver and Captain Brandt. He spoke to the men, shook frozen hands, distributed the last of the cigarettes from Germany. They greeted him with weary respect. No one complained. No one asked when relief would come. He looked into their faces, gaunt, bearded, eyes hollow, and saw what the reports could not convey. On one such visit, a young lieutenant, barely 20, saluted stiffly. "Herr General, the men wish you to know we will hold as long as you order it." Von Arnstadt returned the salute. "I know you will." He drove away. That evening, back in the bunker, Colonel Ritter waited with a new proposal drafted by several division commanders. A limited breakout attempt southward, using the remaining panzers in a concentrated thrust while infantry followed on foot. The plan was detailed, realistic, ruthless in its acceptance of losses. Ritter laid it on the table. They believe it could succeed if launched within days. After that, the men will lack the strength to march. Von Arnstadt studied the overlays. The arrows were precise, the timing tight but feasible. The risks enormous, but the alternative certain. He looked up. "If I approve this without permission, I disobey a direct Führer order. The penalty is not merely my removal, it is the signal that the entire command structure can be ignored when inconvenient." Ritter said nothing. Von Arnstadt continued quietly. "If I forward it for approval, it will be denied, and the denial will confirm that higher headquarters prefers annihilation to admission of error." He pushed the plan back across the table. "We will continue to hold." Ritter gathered the papers. "Yes, Herr General." Later, alone again, von Arnstadt stood before the situation map. The pocket had shrunk to a ragged oval barely 30 kilometers across. Red arrows pressed from every direction. The thought came clearly now, no longer suppressed. To disobey would end my career. To obey would end my army. February 1943 brought no sudden cataclysm. There was no thunderous final assault, no panicked rout, no heroic last stand captured in dramatic photographs. The end of the Sixth Army came quietly, procedurally, almost politely, like a machine running out of power one component at a time. The pocket had shrunk to a ragged patch of snow and rubble barely 15 kilometers long and 5 wide. What had once been a fortress was now 2 isolated fragments. One clustered around the ruined city center and the tractor factory in the north, the other clinging to the southern suburbs and the last airfield at Gumrak. Between them lay Soviet-held ground. Communication was by radio or runner. Supply drops, when they came at all, scattered across enemy lines. General von Arnstadt had moved his headquarters to a deep cellar beneath the Wehrmacht department store in central Stalingrad. The rooms were low-ceilinged, damp, lit by flickering lanterns. Maps covered every wall, updated hourly with the latest front traces. The air smelled of wet concrete, unwashed bodies, and the faint sweetness of decay that no ventilation could remove. He still wore his greatcoat buttoned to the throat. He still shaved when water allowed. He still convened his remaining staff at the appointed hours. Discipline persisted, even as the army dissolved around it. The men no longer fought with rifles and machine guns. Ammunition for small arms was counted in rounds per man, sometimes 10, sometimes 5, sometimes none. Artillery batteries fired their last shells in careful registered barrages, then spiked the guns. Panzer crews abandoned frozen tanks, removing breech blocks and pouring petrol over engines to deny them to the enemy. The remaining aircraft, 3 or 4 battered Heinkels, flew out one final night, carrying wounded officers and the last mail sacks. Gumrak airfield fell the next morning without a shot. Soviet infantry advanced methodically, house by house, cellar by cellar. They used loudspeakers more than bullets now. "Come out, you will be fed, you will be warm, the war is over for you." Many obeyed. They emerged from ruins with hands raised, faces gray, eyes vacant. They walked in columns through the snow toward collection points, guarded by soldiers who looked almost as exhausted as their prisoners. No one cheered. No one resisted. Surrender had become another procedure. In the northern pocket, entire battalions laid down arms when encircled in factory basements. The commanders radioed for instructions. Von Arnstadt's reply was always the same. "Fight on with what you have. The order stands." But there was nothing left to fight with. He issued one final army order on the 30th of January, the 10th anniversary of the regime's seizure of power. It was brief, formal, correct. 6th Army Order. On this historic day, every soldier will remember his oath. We have held the position entrusted to us. We have tied down superior enemy forces. Our sacrifice has not been in vain. Maintain discipline to the end. Long live the Führer. The message was transmitted to every remaining radio set. Few units acknowledged receipt. Most sets had no batteries left. That same day, far away in East Prussia, Hitler promoted von Arnstadt to Field Marshal. The signal arrived by radio, congratulating him on the honor. It implied expectation. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive. Von Arnstadt read the promotion order without visible reaction. He thanked the operator, then returned to the map. Colonel Ritter, one of the last senior officers still present, watched him. "Herr Generalfeldmarschall," he said quietly, using the new title for the first time. "The men in the tractor works report they have no ammunition, no food, no bandages. They ask for permission to capitulate locally." Von Arnstadt looked up. "Permission denied. They will hold." Ritter hesitated. "There are fewer than 2,000 effectives left in that sector. Most are wounded." Von Arnstadt's voice remained even. "Then the wounded will inspire the able-bodied. The order stands." Ritter withdrew. In the cellar corridors outside the command room, wounded lay on straw pallets, wrapped in blankets or greatcoats stripped from the dead. Medical orderlies moved among them with the last morphine ampoules, deciding who still merited relief. Moans echoed softly. No one shouted. Pain had become routine. Captain Brandt, the adjutant, kept the war diary current. The final entries were short. 31st of January, enemy penetrated city center, fighting in streets, supply situation nil, combat strength negligible. 1st February, northern pocket silent, assume overrun, southern pocket reduced to Univermag area. 2nd of February, ammunition exhausted, food exhausted, fuel exhausted, awaiting relief. Von Arnstadt read the entries each evening. He added nothing in his own hand. On the morning of 2nd of February, Soviet troops reached the Univermag square above. Artillery fire shook dust from the ceiling, then silence, then voices in Russian calling down stairwells. A Soviet major descended with an escort, white flag raised. He requested the commander. Von Arnstadt received him in the map room. The Russian officer was correct, almost courteous. He explained that further resistance was pointless. He offered honorable terms, officers to retain sidearms, medical care for wounded, food immediately. Von Arnstadt listened without expression. "I require time to consult my staff." The major agreed to 1 hour. When the Russians withdrew, Ritter and the remaining officers gathered. Von Arnstadt spoke first. "The army has fulfilled its duty. Further sacrifice serves no military purpose. I will authorize capitulation." No one objected. There was nothing left to say. He drafted the final signal himself, addressed to OKH. 6th Army has fought to the last man and the last round in accordance with orders received. Ammunition, food, and fuel exhausted. Further defense impossible. Army capitulates, effective 2nd February 1943 to preserve remaining lives. Long live Germany. He handed it to the radio operator. The set transmitted on emergency power. Then he removed his cap, placed his pistol on the table, and sat down to wait. Soviet soldiers entered the cellar an hour later. They collected weapons, searched briefly for documents, then escorted the headquarters group upward into the blinding snow. Von Arnstadt emerged last. He paused at the top of the stairs, looking across the square. Piles of frozen bodies lay where they had fallen. Abandoned equipment littered the snow. A few German soldiers stood in ragged groups, hands raised, waiting to be marched away. The city was quiet. No shots, no shouts, only the wind. He was searched, photographed, then led to a waiting vehicle. The Sixth Army, once 300,000 strong, the pride of the Wehrmacht, had ceased to exist. Not in chaos, not in mutiny, not in betrayal. In exhaustion, in procedure, in obedience. The orders were correct. The outcome was fatal. The snow kept falling as the columns of prisoners shuffled westward. Tens of thousands of men, gaunt, frost-bitten, wrapped in whatever rags they still possessed, marched under Soviet guard toward railway sidings and distant camps. Few spoke. The wind carried only the crunch of boots and the occasional barked order in Russian. Field Marshal Friedrich von Arnstadt walked near the head of one such column. His greatcoat was unbuttoned, his cap gone, his hands bound loosely in front. Soviet officers had treated him with formal correctness. No blows, no humiliation in front of the men. They had even returned his monocle after searching his pockets. Yet the act of walking in captivity, surrounded by the remnants of the army he had commanded, weighed more heavily than any physical restraint. He did not look back at Stalingrad. There was nothing left to see. The journey lasted weeks. Trains when boxcars were available, forced marches when they were not. Men died along the way, quietly from cold or typhus or simple exhaustion. Bodies were left beside the tracks. No one counted them anymore. Von Arnstadt survived. He was separated from the enlisted men early, transferred to a series of officer camps east of Moscow. The accommodations were Spartan but not brutal. Wooden barracks, thin soup twice daily, occasional interrogations conducted with professional curiosity rather than rage. Soviet officers questioned him about German strategy, logistics, command decisions. He answered factually, without embellishment or apology. "You followed orders that condemned your army?" One interrogator observed in fluent German. "Was this loyalty or blindness?" Von Arnstadt considered the question. "It was duty," he replied. "The alternative was chaos." The interrogator nodded, made a note, and moved on. Years passed in captivity. The war ended. Germany surrendered unconditionally. News reached the camps slowly. Berlin fallen, Hitler dead, the Reich dissolved. Von Arnstadt received the information without visible reaction. He had long since stopped expecting relief. In 1949, after 6 years, he was among the last officers repatriated. A train carried him across a devastated Europe to the British zone of occupation. He stepped onto German soil, thinner, grayer, but still erect. No one greeted him. His wife had died in an air raid in 1944. His children were scattered, strangers now. He settled quietly in a small town in Lower Saxony, supported by a modest pension. Journalists sought interviews. He declined most. When he did speak, his words were measured, unemotional. "I executed the orders given to me. The responsibility for those orders lies elsewhere." He never criticized the Führer directly. He never claimed personal error. His record, as far as the shattered archive showed, remained spotless. No disobedience, no insubordination, no unauthorized actions. A perfect exemplar of the German general staff tradition. Yet the army he had commanded no longer existed. Of the 300,000 men who entered the pocket, fewer than 90,000 survived the first winter in Soviet camps. Only 6,000 ever returned home, many years later, broken in body and spirit. Von Arnstadt lived another decade in quiet retirement. He read military history, corresponded occasionally with former comrades, tended a small garden. He never wrote memoirs. He never sought to justify or explain. He died in 1955, quietly, of heart failure. The obituary in the local paper noted his rank, his decorations, his command at Stalingrad. It did not mention the outcome. But the disaster did not fade from memory. In the rebuilt armed forces of West Germany, the Bundeswehr, Stalingrad became required study. Young officers analyzed the campaign in staff colleges, poring over the same maps von Arnstadt had studied in his bunker. They debated supply calculations, airlift feasibility, the timing of possible breakouts. The conclusions were unanimous. The encirclement should never have been accepted. A commander facing impossible orders must possess the moral courage to act in the interest of his men and the larger war effort. The lesson, however, was carefully phrased. It was never disobey more. German officers, scarred by the memory of military indiscipline in the Weimar years and the excesses of the Nazi regime, recoiled from any doctrine that elevated personal judgment over lawful authority. Instead, the new military doctrine emphasized something subtler. Systems must permit thought. Orders must allow room for professional assessment. Initiative must be encouraged at every level, not punished as defeatism. The chain of command must remain intact, but it must also remain flexible. American and British instructors reinforced the point. They cited their own examples: Market Garden Reconsidered, Patton's improvisations, Montgomery's methodical pauses.